Okay, guys, welcome back. So the last thing we're going to look at in chapter 12 has to do with the concept of deflation. Now, remember in chapter 5, we learned that when inflation rate is negative, we tend to have what we call deflation, okay? So deflation is when prices are generally falling, okay? Or what we also call the negative inflation rate, okay? Right. So if the inflation rate is negative, we tend to have what we call deflation, okay? And that is a general decrease in the price level for consistent amount of time, okay? Right? Um, so that is the definition. An economy experiences deflation when it has a persistent, and again, this is really key. It has to be persistent. It's not just a one-time decrease in the price level, okay, but it has to be a persistent decrease in the price level, okay? So in the next segment of the video, or the next segment of this chapter, basically we're just going to look at what causes deflation, what are the effects of deflation, right? And also how can deflation be ended, right? Most economies, to be honest, rarely experience deflation. Majority of economies always experience some amount of inflation. It could be very high amounts of inflation, or it could be low amounts of inflation. But generally, most economies experience inflation, right? It's rare, very rare for an economy to experience deflation. Japan is the only advanced country that in recent decades has actually had periods of deflation, okay? Right, so if you're looking at the inflation rate for Japan from the period 1995 to roughly the period 2012, okay, Japan actually suffered rates of inflation, okay? So 95, they actually had small periods of deflation. From the period 1999 till 2012, they actually had rates of deflation, okay? Right, where the price level in the country was falling consistently. Now, the major cause of Japan's deflation and the major cause of any deflation is money supply in Japan actually grew at a very, very slow rate. Okay, when money supply grows at a very fast rate, remember from the quantity theory of money, that essentially tends to lead to high levels of inflation. Now, when money supply does the opposite, when money supply does not grow at fast enough rate, it tends to lead to low levels of inflation and sometimes negative inflation known as deflation, okay? So consequences of deflation in Japan was that prices were falling, and this actually reduced the value of wages, and also at the same time it increased the value of debt, okay? Right, so with higher wages and higher debt values and with low prices, businesses actually make less profits, okay, because higher wages, their costs are high. At the same time, they're not selling enough to make a profit. So businesses in Japan cut back on spending, and GDP in Japan fell. Now, as GDP fell, incomes basically fell, and as incomes basically fell, consumption fell. And since there's less demand for goods and services, prices basically fall further, right? In fact, Japan is one of the slowest growing economies amongst most advanced countries over the last 2 decades, okay? So now, first of all, we need to see what causes deflation, right? Now, we said inflation is generally a monetary problem, but we've already learned in chapter 12 that inflation can occur in the short run through demand pull inflation and also cost push inflation. Now, deflation occurs in the short run if the opposite happens. If aggregate demand decreases, okay, or short run aggregate supply increases for a brief period, okay, that basically causes deflation. Now we need to know what will cause aggregate demand to decrease. For example, a fall in investment will cause aggregate demand to decrease. If if businesses are not investing as much, right, or producing as much, then aggregate demand will decrease. A fall in consumption expenditure also decreases aggregate demand. Okay, if people are not spending enough, okay, then it means that the total amount of goods and services bought in the economy generally will reduce. A fall in exports also reduces aggregate demand. Okay, so we need to understand the things that basically reduce aggregate demand. Okay, right, and deflation happens when aggregate demand does not increase fast enough. Okay, or maybe in the short run, basically aggregate supply increases at a really, really fast rate. Now we need to understand the things that will increase aggregate supply. For example, an increase in capital, an increase in labor, an advancement in technology, right? All those factors basically increase the aggregate supply curve, okay? So now if we just try to illustrate this, we have the long run aggregate supply curve, which is vertical. So we have LAS, and then we have the price level. We have GDP over here. We have the short run aggregate supply, which is upward sloping. And then we have the aggregate demand curve, which is basically downward sloping. Okay, right? So we have equilibrium points over here. Let's just call it point A, where they all meet. If aggregate demand decreases, it will shift to the left, right? And we get a new equilibrium point over here, right? Let's call it B. And clearly, you can see that prices have decreased, okay? Clearly, you can see that prices have decreased, okay? Right, so that leads to deflation. Or on the other hand, if supply increases, the aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. And then again, you get to a new equilibrium point. Let's just call this point C, and you compare A to point C. And again, you notice that prices have basically decreased. Okay, so a momentarily decrease in aggregate demand or the short-term aggregate supply curve will basically lead to deflation, will actually cause prices to decrease. Okay, now this happens only in the short run, but in the long run, we need to go to our good old friend, a quantity theory of money, and see how that is related to deflation. Well, if we look at the quantity theory of money, we said that inflation rate, right, according to our quantity theory of money equation, the inflation rate in any economy is equal to the money growth rate plus the rate of velocity change minus real GDP growth rate. Now, how do we get this variable to be negative? Again, if this variable is negative, that means that we tend to have deflation. Okay, that is negative inflation rate. Okay, so deflation only occurs when the inflation rate in the long run tends to be negative. Well, in what scenario is it basically going to be negative, right? That is the main thing. Well, deflation will occur if the money growth rate, right, which is basically this amount, is less than real GDP growth rate minus the rate of velocity change. Again, you're going to have only negative inflation if money growth rate is slower than real GDP growth rate minus the rate of velocity change. Now let's look at an example. Suppose that the rate of velocity change is basically 0. Okay, right? And suppose that real GDP for this country grows at 3%. So we have 3% here. Velocity growth rate does not change. Okay, our equation is basically going to be something like this. Inflation, which I'll just say I, should equal money growth rate, which is M, plus the rate of velocity change, which in this example is 0%, minus 3%, okay? Now, if you actually simplify this, you have inflation equals money minus, actually let me use the minus sign over here, because 0 minus actually let me just clean this. Okay, so 0. Okay, so this is going to be M plus 0 minus 3. Okay, all right, and that is basically going to be I equals M minus 3. Okay, now basically what we're saying is that in what scenario will this I become negative? Well, the only time I will become negative is if M is less than 3. So basically that's what we're saying here. Real GDP growth rate minus the rate of velocity change is, if the money growth rate is less than the real GDP growth rate minus the rate of velocity change, we tend to have deflation. Sorry about that, okay? So in this example, right, inflation becomes only negative if M is basically less than 3, okay? So suppose M equals 2. Well, if M equals 2, then we have I equals negative 1 equals 2 minus 3. Okay, right. In that sense, we have a negative inflation rate, and inflation rate is negative 1%, and that's basically a deflation. Okay, that is deflation. So prices are falling by 1%. Okay, right. So that's what we mean by the quantity theory of money and deflation. In the long run, deflation is also a monetary problem. So let's look at an example. Suppose the velocity growth rate for the economy is 2%. Suppose the GDP growth rate for this economy is basically 3%. If the inflation rate, right, equals the money growth rate plus the rate of velocity change minus real GDP growth rate, at what point in the money growth rate, right, will the inflation rates basically become negative? Okay, so now let's use our formula. We know that the inflation rate equals the money growth rate, right, plus velocity growth minus GDP growth. Okay, so we have 2 minus 3, and that gives us negative 1. Okay, so the money growth rate plus negative 1 is also money growth minus 1. Okay, so in that sense, when will inflation rates be negative? Inflation rate is only going to be negative if this money growth rate, if this variable right here is actually less than 1. For instance, if it's 0.9 minus 1, we have negative 0.1. Okay? But what if it's bigger than 1? If it's bigger than 1, let's say 2 minus 1, well, we actually have a positive number 1, and inflation is basically 1%. Okay, inflation is existing in this economy, right? So we can conclude that if the money growth is higher than 1%, then there is inflation. At the same time, if money growth is less than 1%, then there is deflation. Okay, so that is what we come to with deflation. Okay, that is the conclusion we come to with deflation. Now we'll look at the effects of deflation. What are the consequences of deflation? Well, deflation, as you can see, comes about because there's a decrease in aggregate demand. Okay, right? So generally, deflation tends to happen in the sense that income and wealth is distributed, because when there's a decrease in aggregate demand, prices tend to fall. Okay, this lowers GDP and employment, so people are unemployed, and there's also low income, and the poor generally get poorer in that sense. Okay, so it actually creates an inequality sort of gulf. Okay, and it also diverts resources from production. Okay, because generally the economy doesn't produce as much as before. Okay, so those are the main consequences of deflation: lower real GDP and unemployment, or high unemployment. Okay, and how can deflation be ended? Well, deflation can only be ended by increasing the growth rate of money. But it's not just increasing the growth rate of money. You have to increase the growth rate of money to the point where the growth rate of money exceeds the growth rate of GDP minus the growth rate of velocity. Okay, so that is how inflation can be ended, and these are basically the effects of deflation. Right, now let's do a class activity quickly. Suppose the velocity of money is constant, meaning that the velocity of money does not change over time. Now, if the velocity of money does not change over time, we can say that the growth rate of velocity of money is basically 0. Okay, so velocity rate, I'll just call it VR, equals 0 because it's constant over time. We know that GDP is growing at 3% a year, so GDP equals 3. Okay, these are the two things we know. Let me just write it up here so it doesn't get lost. Okay, so we have velocity rate equals 0 because velocity of money is constant, and we have GDP equaling 3. Now, to achieve an inflation target of 2% a year, what rate should the Federal Reserve grow the quantity of money? In other words, for inflation to be 2% a year, given that the velocity rate is basically 0%, and given that GDP is growing at 3% a year, right? What basically should the money growth rate be? Okay, again, we go to our quantity theory of money equation. So we know that inflation should be 2. So we have 2 equals, we don't know what the money growth rate should be. So we have M plus VR, which is basically 0 minus 3. Okay, so now we have 2, which is the inflation rate, equals M minus 3. Okay, and essentially we're solving for the money growth rate. So the money growth rate should be 2 plus 3 equals M. Okay, and we have 5 equals M. Okay, so essentially we're saying that for the Federal Reserve to maintain inflation rate at 2%, given that GDP is growing at 3% and the velocity of money is not changing over time, it should basically grow money supply at 5%. Okay, it should basically grow money supply at 5%, and basically it comes down to our quantity theory of money equation. Okay, this equation is really important and it's also really powerful. Okay, our next question basically is, at what growth rate of the quantity of money will deflation be created? So we know that we have we have the inflation rate equals M minus 3. Again, how do we get minus 3? Well, we know that velocity rate equals 0 and GDP equals 3. So we have 0 minus 3 and have minus 3. At what point will I become negative? Well, we already know that I will become negative at the point where M is basically less than 3. Okay, so take any number or pick any arbitrary number which is less than 3. Okay, let's use 2. If M equals 2, we have I equals 2 minus 3, and inflation is basically negative 1. If M equals 1, we have 1 minus 3, and inflation is basically negative 2. So long as M is going to be less than 3, we're actually going to have a negative inflation rate. And again, a negative inflation rate is essentially the deflation rate. Okay, right, so I'll basically stop here because there are some things I didn't cover in the previous chapter that will not necessarily help you understand the short run Phillips curve. Okay, so this is where chapter 12 is going to end. Again, guys, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me, watch the videos, and just send me an email that you want to talk to me and you want to understand the concept better. I've had a couple of people come in already. I'm trying to understand the concepts a bit better, which is really helpful. Okay, I hope you guys have a good weekend. Happy Halloween, and I'll see you around sometime. Okay, thank you.